Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today. What's wrong with my oaks? I've been getting that question for the last few years, and we might shine some light on what's happening in Illinois with some of our oaks and other trees out there. And you know, I'm not doing this by myself. I am happy to be joined this week by horticulture educator Emily Swihart in Milan, or as I like to say, Milan, Illinois. Emily, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. Good to see you. And yes, Milan, wherever. Happy to be here. This is a really interesting topic that our colleague brought to us. I am really excited to be sitting in on this one. I think there's going to be some aha moments maybe for some folks. I know at least reading through this article and having some of the pre-discussions really opened my eyes to some things we suspected, but maybe we'll have some more clarity on after this conversation. So looking forward to it.
As am I. This report that came out, it is 94 pages, and we will leave a link to that below in the show notes if folks want to dive into the data. It's a good long read, but we will have that available to you if you want to dive into it. But we are going to bring on our special guest for today, who's going to help us parse out some of this information in this report. Horticulture educator Ryan Pankau in Champaign, or as I like to say, Champaign, Illinois. Hi, Ryan. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to hear that Champaign has a fancy name too. Yeah,
yes,
that's pretty cool.
Yes. I try to, spread the love out everywhere. When I went to Carbondale, Champaign Urbana was always shampoo banana. So it's just words are weird in my brain. So that's. But yes, the finest of champagnes. Ryan, thank you for being on the show today to discuss this report, and it's we're gonna do a dive on this. So I'm excited to do it.
Yeah, so let's just get into it because there is a lot to discuss, and we don't really want this to turn into a 2-hour discussion. We'll try to limit ourselves, even though that'd be fun. First, I'm going to just read the title of the article the study that you sent. So it's Understanding the Extent and Consequences of Chemical Trespass for Illinois Ecosystems. So before we get into the study, I like to take an opportunity to look at the bigger picture before diving into some details. We know the ecosystems and the landscape is not interacting with us or with each other in silos. And so as we're talking about ecosystems in Illinois, Ryan, could you give us kind of a high level view of what the Illinois landscape is, maybe how it's evolved since human interaction, especially like when it comes to the agrarian lifestyle that we have been living in for 100 years or so? Like, what does Illinois look like?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, it has an interesting land use history if we look at it across the last several hundred years of, real, European human settlement, wherever we want to say, like how the landscape has changed in just modern times, where, pre-settlement, if we want to call it that, before kind of Europeans came across and, occupied this entire continent. Really, Illinois' history was driven by glacial history. You guys probably know this, that we had, periods of glaciers that really kind of scrubbed the surface of the state flat and clean. And after those glaciers receded, then, I'm really covering a lot of years with just a few sentences here, but essentially prairie dominated our landscape because it was flat plains, because of some, there was some weather anomalies that caused grasses to expand into Illinois. So we're part of what's called the Prairie Peninsula that kind of extends into Illinois of tall grass prairie. But what we saw was a mosaic, though, of forest and prairie, with forest kind of in some of our drainage areas and in lower areas, and most of the plains occupied by prairie vegetation. And that is what gave us just some of the best soils in the world in this state and across the Midwest in these prairie regions. Those prairie plants put a lot of organic matter down into their root system, which roots die and decompose, and that added a lot of organic matter to the soil. So we see, soils like the Drummer Silty clay loam, our state soil. Some of us looked at that at our last Hort team in service in the field and in soil samples, but resulting in 19 inches of topsoil in that case in a lot of places with Drummer, and that's just phenomenal crop growing soil. So for the last 100 years or so, this Illinois landscape has been dominated by agriculture. And, in more modern times here, the last 50 plus years, it's been really intensive row crop agriculture. And we've seen, the numbers of original prairie are very low, like less than 1% of the original prairie remains. And so we've replaced that area largely with agriculture. I think some of it's probably went to urban sprawl and human expansion. And I've always, around Champaign-Urbana, there's really great examples of that, of just some of this really awesome farmland being paved over with neighborhoods and spaces that, we humans need to exist. So that's happened too. So for a variety of reasons, we've went from we're called the Prairie State, went from the Prairie State to the crop state or the agriculture state or whatever you want to call us nowadays. But I guess we still go by the Prairie State. But that's kind of a summary. I don't know. Were there other aspects of land use history you all were interested in discussing here?
Ryan, that was a good synopsis. Now, I know your background is with forestry with the USDA, and I always thought it was amazing when a forester or even someone who knows a lot about prairie ecosystems, when they can walk into a landscape and they can kind of read what has happened. So Illinois, I mean, we're the Prairie State, Southern Illinois, lots of forest, but then there was a lot of logging that occurred, correct, when Europeans first came in to settle this area?
Yeah, and so there's very little of Illinois that was not logged, or cut over, and that was probably mid 1800s to early 1900s is where just that's a really important thing to understand. Like lots of our forests were cleared. Southern Illinois, which remains really hilly, and if you haven't visited Southern Illinois ever, it's mind blowing. It is a different landscape. And that shows you the difference between the glaciated, northern part of the state and central part of the state and the unglaciated south part of the state. There's a big difference. There's still hills and hollers and trees and all that stuff. But some of that early, clearing of the forests of Southern Illinois was for agriculture. And what we found was and remember those areas never were under prairie cover, so they don't have that 19 inches of topsoil and just all this great productivity. A forest soil has about 2 to 4 inches of topsoil, and when you clear off the trees and start plowing it to farm it, all that washes downhill. And so what folks found is a lot of that farming didn't pan out in Southern Illinois, and we actually have some really eroded soils down there that were reforested. And the biggest effort in that reforestation that I think of happened around the time of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that was, following the Depression. It was a way to get folks employed through the government to do these conservation projects, and one of those was tree planting across Southern Illinois. And you can see a lot of hilltop pine stands are some of the remnants of that. Hardwood trees were planted as well, but I feel like in my mind, those pine stands were a big Band-Aid for the most eroded spots, and pine trees can handle some of those harsh conditions. And that's whether that's true or not, that's how I've always thought about it. Now fast forward to today, the Shawnee National Forest is actually looking at getting rid of those pine stands. Those are some of the first things that they're trying to manage and get hardwoods back in, because they're non-native pines. Like we got one tiny little chunk of some native shortleaf pine in Southern Illinois, but really that's about it. So yeah, a lot of our woodlands have been harvested, have been, I would always say as a forester, not managed. And by that, I mean, there wasn't a plan. We might have taken trees out and sold them for timber or firewood or whatever, for whatever reason, but there wasn't this long-term plan that a forester like me, that was my job with the USDA, was to help you as a landowner write a plan for sustainable harvest and diversity of trees and all the things that you try and manage for. And so that's what we see, is just the majority of our forested areas are unmanaged, and have been so for the last several hundred years. But by unmanaged, I don't mean there wasn't human impacts in there. I just mean it wasn't planned with good forestry in mind.
Yes, I was going to say basically the same thing Chris said, which is like, that's a brilliant description. And it lays a foundation for us now to talk about those spaces, because those unmanaged, not uninfluenced tracts of land are now a lot of the recreation spaces that we still, are using as the public, that are available to most folks, and were the subject of this study. So again, before we get into the details of the study, it talks about chemical trespass. We should probably define that for folks before we really get into the details. So do you mind giving another brilliant description? No pressure.
Yeah, well, I mean,
what is chemical trespass?
without getting too brilliant, I mean, it's really pesticide drift is what we're talking about, or in this case specifically, herbicide drift is most of what the damages we're seeing. And so that's where in this, ag-dominated landscape, it is actually, I mean, just essential to spray pesticides on agricultural crops to get the production system in place and production level that we expect today. We can't produce, we can't farm without these chemicals. And so over time, as more of those have been employed in this agricultural system, they're going other places than just the crop fields around them. And so I know some of my interest in this topic is just from all the folks that call me and have these type problems, or presenting, showing me plant problems that are similar to what we would see caused by herbicide damage. So chemical trespass is kind of the other word for this, but that's essentially what we're talking about is pesticide drift in one form or another, as a chemical that's trespassing across the property line. And, in most all cases, it's absolutely unintended. It's not like there's no one out there that's doing this on purpose. But the fact of the matter is this chemical is crossing a property line where it's not intended to be.
Yep. And this trespass can occur kind of in three different ways, right? It can be wind carried just at the time of application. It can be carried, with wind speeds that are able to transport those vapors. Can be volatilized, right? It can actually leave the plant material and turn into a gas, go from a liquid to a gas, or go from a solid to a gas and move that way. Or it can be in the water, right? It can migrate through the soil or through our waterways on the backs of H2O. So.
Yeah, and those first two types that you were describing there are first particle drift, where it's the physical droplets, versus vapor drift, which is an invisible gas, like you said, that kind of just evaporates off the plant. I'm sure that's not the scientific term for how it happens, but turns to a gas, floats around, and contacts another plant and causes damage. So as a vapor.
So Ryan, reading through the study, I recognize several of these names in this report. So who did the research here? What organizations are we talking about? And what I know we were all having these observations of, that question I asked at the beginning of the show, what's wrong with my oak? But they're kind of looking at these ecosystems. What was their objective?
Well, so my take on this study is that it was a report to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And really the basis in my mind of this study is a report to the IDNR on the status of their nature preserves. So if you're not aware of this, there's a nature preserve system established in Illinois where parcels of land can be designated a nature preserve. And they have to meet certain criteria for floristic quality, I don't know all the criteria that goes into this. I help folks manage those nature preserves after they were designated at USDA. So I'm aware of this. So it's basically an area of a lot of biological integrity, a high value site that we've designated a nature preserve. And we were seeing a lot of, chemical trespass or pesticide damage in these nature preserves across the state. And so out of concern, the Illinois Natural History Survey are the folks that actually implemented this study and did it. And you can see kind of a list of the folks. That's probably who you're recognizing, Chris, is different biologists at INHS that helped do the field data collection. And there really was, I think they did a good job of having a small group of folks kind of do this huge study. Because, I mean, it looked at sites across the state. So let's see, they had 185 different sites across the state they looked at. And so about 83 of those sites were in the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission system. But about 102 of those were randomly sampled from the CTAP sites that the state set up. So, CTAP is an acronym for kind of long-term monitoring of different plant populations. So they were established maybe in the 90s, and they've been looked at time and time again to look at trends and changes in plant population and other things. Those are on some public sites. Those are on some nature preserves, but they're kind of randomly scattered around the state and meant to be this representative sample. Those CTAP sites are. So they took, a randomly sampled group of those CTAP sites and coupled them with nature preserve sites, and that's where we've gathered this data. So another interesting thing to understand about the Illinois Nature Preserve system is that it's not all just public land, it's also private land. So at USDA, I only help private landowners manage their property. And so any of those sites that I worked on was a nature preserve on private property. So anyway, so that's where this report came from. It's a report to IDNR, who manages that nature preserve system, and it's on, how is this happening across the state, and not just on nature preserves, but on other sites too. So they really try to take a pretty holistic, pretty rigorous look at this problem around the state.
And reading through it, I noticed, they made sure to specify like, hey, these are as random as we can get. We are not targeting any sites that we have know that we have chemical trespass on. Like we're trying to be as random as we can. Having that long-term data is also so important. I think it's so hard. We're all tree people here. Well, you two are definitely tree people. I pretend to be a tree person. Tree research is so hard because it takes so long, and you got to get published, and then you got to write a grant for the next research project. So this is like really critical data, long-term data, to have stuff like this. So Ryan, what were they sampling for in these sites? What was being collected? Were they just looking at specific species of trees? Were they going down to the forest floor? What was being collected?
Sure. They did collected a variety of different types of data, from just simply visual assessment of the damage and assigning a level of damage from no damage to lots of damage. But they also sampled leaf tissue, and they also took some soil samples, and those samples were done pretty randomly. That was the intent with the way they collected it. So there wasn't necessarily one species they keyed on, or one particular type of plant. It was from all different types of plants. And they did release kind of some lists of the most damaged species. So we know from that, I know you've mentioned oaks quite a bit. Oaks were just one of the species hardest hit. And I mean, that's a group of species. Quercus is kind of the genus they all fall in. So those Quercus species took the hardest hit of any in the study. But let's see, they actually published, or gave us kind of a list of what some of the other, what I'm looking at is a list of the species with the greatest injury, where, this is down to species. So there's quite a few oaks up there at the top. So just kind of running down the top 10, it was shingle oak, blackjack oak, redbud, post oak, black oak, box elder, pin oak, bur oak, swamp white oak. So you see there's kind of a theme here. Hackberry comes in, persimmon and shagbark hickory. I went a little beyond the top 10, but those are some of the ones that come into this, the most damaged species. So where we saw like the most damage on oak species, they're also noting that redbud and box elder were both very good indicator species, meaning they would be some of the first species to show signs. And I can say I've definitely observed that on both of those. They're pretty quick to show signs of damage. They're pretty sensitive.
So Ryan, the species that you just listed off, I want to get to the results, but I want to hang out on those species for a few minutes, because those are, when you read that list, in my mind, I go to Keystone Species. These are native, they're prevalent. The sites were selected. They made an effort to choose a site in every county. I think they might have missed one or two, but they made a strong effort to sample, with a large geographic distribution throughout the state. So not just one area. They weren't, like Chris, you said, like they weren't looking at the prevalence of reports of suspected damage. It was across the state, and those species are spread across the state. And these are species that show up in a lot of different landscapes, including our community landscapes. Like, that just stood out to me, and it helped take this study, which does look at wild spaces, that natural spaces, and not a lot of us are privileged enough to manage. We enjoy, and it brought it into like my backyard. I have a number of those species in my own backyard. I'm sure listeners and viewers do too. Like, any thoughts or comments just before we move on? I don't know. It was kind of heart-wrenching to me when I heard that those species were some of the most susceptible, or
Yeah, a lot of common urban trees on that list, right? A lot of things we see around our communities. I mean, not to jump back off of that, but I mean, definitely those are sensitive species within every urban forest. And let's face it, in Illinois, a lot of our urban forests are close to areas of pesticide application. But I mean, going back to our kind of land use history and the significance in Illinois from a kind of a forest management standpoint, and I guess this study also looked at grasslands and wetlands and other types of habitat types. So they were trying to be unbiased in their sampling. But I think we get most concerned with this long-term perennial vegetation, trees and shrubs and forest ecosystems and how they're maybe being impacted by this. And so Illinois forests are experiencing kind of a turnover right now. And by right now, I mean in current decades. Nothing happens fast in a forest, but what we're seeing is a shift towards more shade tolerant species. And what I mean by that is basically sugar maple and beech are the big shade tolerant species, meaning they can grow in 100% shade in the understory, no problem. Where oaks need about 40 to 60% sunlight in that understory to be competitive and to grow into the next forest. There's lots of pressure on that understory right now from those shade tolerant native species I just mentioned, like maple and beech, but also from invasive species. We've seen the widespread bush honeysuckle. It's probably the biggest threat to forest plant diversity in the state, and it's 100% shade tolerant. It can grow in 100% shade. And so what's changed in our forest long term? Well, we've removed fire from the landscape. So historically, either naturally caused fire or mostly human, caused fire by Native Americans and others on the landscape in the past drove this kind of fire dependent ecosystem in Illinois in our forests. Also, oaks gain a bit of a competitive advantage in dry, rocky hilltops and drier sites, more harsh sites. So when you look at Illinois, we don't have a ton of dry, rocky, harsh sites. We've got kind of a mosaic of it all. So that's where oaks have a hard time competing without something like fire, some type of disturbance in that forest ecosystem that keeps some sunlight coming in and breaks up that canopy. Smokey the Bear, is one of those famous conservation cartoon characters. I've heard quotes where that Smokey's more well known than Mickey Mouse worldwide and other things like that. Led us to stop, like really eliminate fire. And so bringing up to nowadays, we understand fire is a management tool. It's a necessary part of these ecosystems, but for many, many years, we've excluded it. We've also subdivided the landscape into smaller and smaller tracts. So we don't have like a large scale landscape level fire like you would have seen in the 1500s across this continent that can help, promote oaks. So we have to manage for oaks if we want them in our ecosystems. And so to see them as the most impacted species, that's super scary. And that's a big focus of forest management right now, is keeping oaks in the forest ecosystem in Illinois. And why do we care about that? Well, for two reasons. One is economical. They're probably the highest value timbered species we can manage for in a woodland. But secondly is an ecological reason, and that's the simple fact that an oak-dominated ecosystem is the most diverse we can manage for. So it supports the most insects, the most plants, the most animals, the most of everything that we can manage for. So if we lose oak ecosystems in Illinois, we lose all that diversity that goes with them. And that's why we care about this, and that's why it is a big thing to hear that oaks are the most impacted species in this report.
Ryan, did you get a sense of where they were collecting these samples? I'm just curious, like, were they at the interface of agriculture and natural areas. So all of us that are more interior from some of this chemical use we're okay, and there's
Um,
no impact.
well, no, I think it's pretty. They tried to break it up where they were sampling. It wasn't right at the edge of things because one of the statistics they reported is that proximity to soybeans predicted level of herbicide damage. So that tells me that their data set, there's some points that are further and closer to a soybean field. But that was an interesting point, so that, proximity to soybeans predicted level of herbicide damage.
And then I guess we need to dive into some of these things that they found. So they had two kind of major sample collection periods. There was early season and sort of mid late season. So let's start early season. What was found uh, early on?
Sure. Like with those early season results, what they were seeing was a lot more herbicides. That that's the big pick. That's the main story here. So early season, we're seeing a lot of herbicides. Later in the year, we're seeing more fungicides, a lot more fungicides, and then they also noted an insecticide was part of that later season application, and that goes right along with agricultural production systems and what's being applied. So that kind of makes sense to see that trend. But the early season chemicals they most reported were atrazine and 2,4-D. Um, so those are a couple big, agriculturally focused chemicals. Those are also things we see in the landscape, in lawn care and other things. We see a lot of 2,4-D being applied for broadleaf control. So, I mean, well, these points are all kind of out in rural areas and not really in the urban space. This report doesn't cover, Emily, you mentioned kind of urban trees. It really doesn't cover a lot of the effects of urban trees or, a lot of reports I get are from urban areas. And, this chemical trespass or pesticide drift can also happen from other things that are going on in urban spaces, whether it's, really intensely managed landscapes or just a lot of this intense turf grass management we see in places. That's one of the culprits. Or, I mean, I've even seen instances of it pesticide drift from invasive species control that other people are doing in and around parks and urban areas that is going off target. So, while the finger gets kind of pointed at agriculture in this report, I think we have to note there's lots of other ways that this chemical trespass is happening. This report is kind of focused on, these type
Yeah.
settings that aren't necessarily right in the middle of a city or town.
One
Yeah.
of the findings that I found startling was so not just the discovery of the pesticides and the fungicides, but the distribution of the findings. So what it was, correct me if like 74%, right, found of the samples found to have pesticides like throughout the state. Like what was it? 97% of the sites, I think. That's what I wrote down.
Yeah.
That's
So
a lot of sites. Go ahead.
that's a lot. And it was 74% had at least one pesticide,
Okay.
measured of all their samples. And 97% of their sites had a positive sample. So that's, high statistical significance there. And some of the other, that's based off of chemical analysis of leaf tissue and soil samples. So that was that is lab data where they also measured visual signs, and this is where it kind of, the fact that they've limited this study to a limited number of people that actually did it comes into play, where they have visual assessments and levels. And I've done this kind of field work in the past for other things, stream rating systems and other things, where you have to all decide what a number 5 is, and be consistent across sites.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of some of the point of this visual assessment, is having a kind of standardized way we're saying, hey, across the whole site, where you've looked at the micro scale of a leaf tissue sample with what you're citing, where then the visual assessment is a little bit bigger, and a bigger assessment of the site as they kind of walked through it and assessed plants and took samples. And so with that, they're saying 99% of their sites had some kind of visual damage associated with it, where they could see signs of these, telltale, the signs of herbicide damage. So some of the symptoms, and they gave it different levels of the damage. So 99% had some signs of visual damage, but 92% of those sites had moderate damage, and 54% of those sites had severe damage they were seeing. So over half the sites measured had severe damage that they could visually assess and just see right when they walked up. One interesting point, though, that relates all this together and goes back to the kind of the leaf tissue sampling is that leaves with greater visual damage did not necessarily have greater herbicide concentrations in the lab tests, which is interesting. So I'm not that'd be something that would be really cool to talk with these researchers about what they think's going on there. To me, that means that we can't rely on visual assessment to know what kind of herbicide level is in that leaf. It really does take a lab assessment to tell us good or bad, high or low, what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you said that. That was surprising. And it does cause me to step back and think, like our visual assessments are only giving us a picture of what is happening. It doesn't seem, that's counterintuitive, to what I would have suspected, or I would have said, if I was betting on it, I would have said, well, visual, assessment would give us a pretty good idea of what's going on. But I thought that was a really interesting point.
And I would guess there's probably some statistics they could run to test for this, and they maybe ruled it out. But we know that certain species are more susceptible and show symptoms better. So I'm sure they did some type of statistical test to kind of control for that. But that would be another thing this leads me to wonder about, are we seeing those, just more susceptible species really show extreme effects really quick for small concentrations? And I don't know that question was teased out in this report or that they mentioned it, but it's kind of something else that factors into this is individual species susceptibility.
Yeah, there's so many variables when you're doing a study statewide. You have to just be like, I can't look at all of it. I have to keep my focus narrow. That's so hard as researchers to do because you want to look at all of it, but it muddles too much the data and everything. So you have to stay focused. Yes.
Well, and do long-term studies, like continue the study. This is a snapshot. This is really interesting information. But it is from this year. So with this year's weather patterns, the singular year's crop rotation patterns, we traditionally do corn and soybean rotation. Ryan, you'd mentioned some of the prevalence and the association with having soybeans nearby versus corn. Well, does that flip? Does that change? There's so much more to learn from this.
Well, and this was just a snap, like the data were actually collected in 2023. The report was issued in 2024, so last year, but it is a snapshot. And actually, Chris, I think you found a really good kind of recording of the researchers discussing this. So I'm sure we'll get that in the show notes.
Yep.
But they do talk about this exact kind of thing where year to year, we would see differences in this data. And one of the cool things they showed in that they talked about or discussed a little bit in that recording was maps that show kind of where the heavy damage was for different things, or where they're, kind of a distribution map across the state of where they found this thing. And that was kind of the context in which they discussed that was, in a different year, we would expect to maybe see a different map of this density of damage or pesticide level. So things would definitely change year to year. This is just a snapshot.
Yeah.
What's interesting in that video recording that they discuss also they're kind of surprised, but also the two chemicals that I see most often maligned on social media, dicamba and neonicotinoids. They said we really didn't find that much. They were kind of expecting to find more. They really didn't.
Yeah, and I mean, a couple years ago, gosh, dicamba was just in the news constantly. You guys both probably remember this. And because it does get some of that volatility and vapor drift, where again, that's not, the sprayer drives by and some drift wafts over. That is, a vapor, an invisible vapor, a gas kind of drifting around. And Chris, you noted like some of that damage was on other adjacent crop fields and things the year that all this was just in the news. And so I was surprised to see not as much dicamba, but more 2,4-D was really the big growth regulating hormone, that we saw. And that's what really is causing a lot of these ill effects on trees and shrubs and things, and deformities are those growth regulating hormones. So that was the big one they found, and not necessarily dicamba.
I'm going to step back a little bit. You say about like leaf deformity. Just for the audience, could you just give a couple of examples of like what you mean when you say that? And so if folks aren't familiar, maybe hopefully haven't seen some leaf abnormality.
Yeah,
like, what does
I mean,
it look like?
we can kind of characterize those signs of damage from a pesticide that are pretty commonly what we would see are kind of twisted, deformed leaves. That growth pattern's kind of weird and deformed. Cupping of leaves, so that's kind of the leaf cups, curves up.
Mhm.
In a red bud, it's kind of cupped this way, where I think I've seen it's usually kind of cupped downward on most species that you see. It's really common that new growth that comes out, like those little, as leaves start to emerge, they don't have a thick cuticle and as much development as other things, and they're a little more susceptible. They get exposed a little harder. So seeing deformed new growth, seeing just really kind of like on a lot of the oaks, they become like really skinny, long, elongated leaves with the lobes. The distribution of the lobes is weird. There's times where on a white oak, I couldn't even tell you that from a leaf it was a white oak. I'm looking at the trunk, and there's some telltale signs in the bark that would tell you it's a white oak, or acorns around. But I mean, that's extreme cases where it's not recognizable to species. But I'm trying to think of some of the other things that, I mean, those are the big ones, and that's a low level exposure usually that's kind of causing that cupping and other things where, with a lot of drift exposure, and this is probably, I would guess, from particle drift is where I've kind of seen this happen. I mean, it's killing leaves, or there's dead spots on leaves, and causing damage that way. But for the most part, a lot of this damage, we're just seeing kind of weird shaped leaves, deformed leaves. Discoloration can also go along with that. They can be a bit discolored. But as I describe all these things, I mean, what else does that look like? There's maybe the cupping is the one thing I don't see a lot of other times, but a lot of other plant stresses cause discolored leaves, cause leaves that are dying, so that's where, gosh, as extension professionals and as for a lot of folks, it's just really hard to ever peg pesticide damage as the cause for these symptoms you see. And I think that's why this study was really enlightening to me. It's looking at it across the state, and it's telling me like, gosh, a lot of these things I think I'm seeing could be, or most likely could be, herbicide damage when it's in close proximity to areas that we know pesticides are being applied, be it an ag field, be it a golf course, be it another area that's managed for turf, heavy turf management. So I still think we need to be a little careful and not saying that just anything with weird looking leaves is pesticide damage. And I don't think that's where anybody that produced this report was intending to send folks. And I try to be really careful when talking with folks about this, but just the number of reports I'm getting in our office and people I'm talking to. And I mean, this time of year on a weekly, daily basis, I'm getting reports. I mean, a lot of this stuff is most likely pesticide damage. I don't know the other causes. So,
Yeah.
One of the things you do when you're talking with someone like this is you start to kind of narrow down and eliminate what are some of the lookalikes, what are some of the things I can rule out. And, I think we should talk about that a little bit. What are some of the big lookalikes to herbicide damage? Like, what can you both kind of think of? I kind of had jotted down a little bit of a list, trying to scroll down to, but some lookalike things.
I definitely know that freeze damage, that late season freeze.
Mm-hmm.
As leaves emerge from their bud, they're very susceptible to injury of all kinds, whether it's a drifting herbicide or some other, temperature stress or insect stress or disease stress. That's it's that moment in that leaf's life that it is most susceptible to some type of injury.
Yeah, and the timing too is sometimes, especially with those early season symptoms, that first assessment that they did, like that can be confusing. If we have a later frost or a later cold spell. can really kind of throw the public.
Yeah, I mean, and even just something as simple as drought stress and basic
Yeah.
environmental stress can produce signs like this. Um, things like, I mean, as simple as soil compaction. There's a lot of environmental stresses we can say kind of cause this, and compared to a disease where one thing we can say with a lot of disease and usually a lot of insects is that it's pretty species specific. We're going to see this one
Yeah.
type of tree damaged by this one disease, where that's another part of this pattern in the puzzle I'm piecing together is in a lot of these cases I'm seeing multiple species damaged at the same time by the same thing. Now that can be, frost is a good example of an environmental, freeze damage is something that would happen the same way. It's indiscriminate. It's going to cause same damage in the same things. But I mean, let's face it, in June, we're not having much freeze damage, So it is a complicated puzzle to sort this out without those lab tests. And that's what's really great about this study is it incorporated lab testing, but for your average homeowner or your average person like us looking at damage in the landscape, those lab tests can sometimes be as much as a couple $100 a sample. I've seen them less than 100, but I've seen them over a couple $100, and that's pretty expensive just to say like, yes, I have herbicide damage. It's cheaper
Yeah.
to piece it together, if you
Mhm.
can eliminate other things, but
And if you were to do that, like, then what do you do? Like, if your trees are impacted, like the damage is done. Like, what? Because we get these calls, we advise people, with a lot of this information, but then they want to know, what do we do? They get concerned about the welfare of their tree.
yeah, and that's what is it's really tough because I mean it's not like that you can say oh, here's the antidote, go apply this to your tree and it
Yeah.
reverses all effects. You're right, damage has happened, and going forward, I mean there is not a lot we can do other than sit and watch and assess, other than just eliminating other environmental stresses. So don't let the things we talked about, soil compaction, drought stress, extreme wind exposure, if you can help limit that, don't let those things add additional stress to your tree or shrub. And also, I mean, not watch for disease and insects. This is a weakened plant, and that those are the kind of places where a lot of diseases or insects take hold. So, gosh, for a lot of people, it's a wait and see thing. It's some of the basics of just your basic tree care of when it's really hot, water this plant some, or like I'm sure both of you guys recommend this all the time. Add some mulch over the root system to preserve moisture to
A
help with that.
lot of mulch, a big mulch ring. We don't see that much.
Yeah, and so that you have this person though that's contacted you and has a severely damaged tree, and it's like, well, I'm hope it's going to be okay. I hope it's just foliar damage, your plant sustained. Um, but could you put a big giant mulch ring around it? And I've talked to people where it's like that's a dilemma because it's like
Yeah.
my tree looks so bad, I don't know if it's going to live. Which in most cases, I'm seeing these plants turn around the next year. Uh, and so do I invest all the time and money of putting out a giant mulch ring for something that could not be alive? And my argument to that is, hey, you already wanted a tree there, you already planted one. Let's say this one dies, you've got the mulch ring for the next one. It's
Mhm.
it's established.
Hmm. Yeah.
um,
And when we talk about like that decline spiral, like you had mentioned, kind of like mitigating what you can in terms of stress. And so if it has, some stress from what we think could be pesticide drift, then maybe don't prune as severely or at all, the following year, water, like mulch, like you said, some of these things. But that decline spiral is something, if folks are more interested in, we've got some resources, or just call up one of us to talk about it. But basically, it is the compounding effect of stressors. And so keep that in mind.
yeah, I mean, just really baby that tree if it's been damaged. Don't
Yeah.
park your truck under it. That's soil
Yeah.
compaction. I mean, even just, soil compaction is so hard for people to wrap their mind around. It's not a bulldozer driving across the surface or a
Right.
tractor. It's even human foot traffic. If it's an area of high traffic, if you're mowing a lot under it, all those things are soil compaction compared to, the forest floor in an undisturbed forest.
Hmm.
what traffic does it have? I mean, maybe a deer hoof from time to time, or but it's not, but there's nothing like what we humans do to that soil environment. So when you have the stressed tree, stay off that root system as much as possible. Um, I mean, again, there's not a ton of things we can tell folks to do, but that watching and monitoring is an important part of this. And I've had people be alarmed and call me back when their plant had some new growth in later in the year after some of this damage. And that's a happy story. That is like, hey, your plant had enough energy reserve to mount a response. It's responding, and it's putting out new leaves. So that's good. That's what we want to see. What scares me is when we have zero plant response, and it just, if anything, its vigor goes downward,
Hmm.
for the rest of the year. That's a sign of it going into decline, which, to define that, that's just that slow spiral towards death that we see so many trees. I mean, really, that's how most trees die. And it's not from one thing, it's from a combination of things that just slowly kind of let it fade away. Um, so monitoring your tree is a huge recommendation. And again, like that healthy new growth coming out, that's great. I mean, that's actually going back to some of the indicators of herbicide damage. Um, Healthy new growth and damaged old growth is a sign of, damage from a chemical,
Yeah.
because when that older growth came out, it was damaged. The new growth wasn't there. New growth comes out, it's undamaged. And you can see that on not only trees and shrubs, but other herbaceous plants will show that same kind of symptom too, where it's another part of the stem is less damaged that's younger. So
Um, One plug though, and I know you know this, Ryan, like this is just, I want to drive this point home. You talk about babying trees when they have experienced stress. Like if they're putting out new growth, still baby those trees. Like they are. That's a really good sign. But they're using stored energy reserves to put that second flush of growth out. And so continue to water through the fall, into the winter. Like make sure they go into winter hydrated. All of the things we all talk about like ad nauseum. But I'm going to do it again. So just a reminder to people.
no, that's a good reminder. And I mean, I've seen some places recommend trying to prune the plant heavily to not have that herbicide
Yeah.
translocate further. And I don't think I agree with that recommendation. And some of it has to do with managing that energy flow in the plant, where all those pruning wounds that you open up, heavily pruning this already stressed plant, require a
Yeah.
lot of energy to grow over, as opposed to, a leaf that you could leave on there that's kind of deformed, that's going to at least photosynthesize and return energy for the year. And, when you understand also, or when you think about also, what are these signs telling us? So we've got kind of deformed leaves on this plant, but for that herbicide to really kill the plant, it really needs to translocate into the tissues, you know, down to the roots, and start to really kill things. For a lot of this exposure, that's not what we're getting, though. And it's not, and I'm speaking from experience as someone that's sprayed herbicides on plants to try and kill them, and have seen it not work from time to time. And you can tell, that plant really didn't get a full dose of this chemical in the way it was labeled and meant to be applied to a woody plant. And so I think that's a little bit of consolation for some people when I'm discussing this with them. It's like, hey, if this herbicide was applied directly to your plant as labeled to kill a woody plant, uh, it would be translocating to the roots and really killing this plant. Where what we're seeing, with cupped leaves, some deformity, is like not that full dose happening here. So, the consolation there is like it got a lower dose than the lethal dose, and let's hope it can deal with that and grow out of it, and we can baby it through. So, something else to think about.
What a very common question I get when on this topic with a client or a homeowner, landowner, what have you is, can I stop this? Is there a way to prevent chemical trespass from occurring? Is there a way for that I can protect my trees or garden, whatnot, from being exposed?
Yeah, it's a common question I get too, and I'm in the central part of the state, and you see lots of yards, out in the rural countryside that are just right, that plot of land where their yard is just right in the middle of a cornfield. and so they're just, I mean, in really close proximity where, one of the things that we've kind of talked about with this is a vegetative buffer of some kind to kind of limit that damage coming into your yard and the more valuable plants. And really, the way we've talked about these vegetative type buffers is in the form of a windbreak in the past. And so I think that is a way that you can start to kind of put a barrier between your more valuable plants and where, damage is coming in from. But that takes up space. So that's a problem. If you don't have a very big yard, if you don't own the crop field adjacent to it, you can't really plant out into it to create a bigger buffer. So windbreaks can help with, we've talked about a couple different forms of drift: particle drift, where it's direct drops and things, and then vapor drift. A windbreak's going to do a little bit more for particle drift, that actual physical spray wafting in there, than it is for vapor drift. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions with designing and putting in a windbreak for this purpose, for drift reduction, is the density of that planting, where if you're just all out blocking the wind, you want on the north side of your property from those cold winter winds or whatever, a windbreak, a pretty dense windbreak is probably the best idea. It's going to stop as much wind as possible. Where in this case, we're trying to intercept particle drift, you actually want a little bit of space for air to get in. You want to slow down the wind speed as it enters the buffer, but then have some space that it can get through. So you don't want as dense of a buffer planting, so there can be some time for those particles to drop out and be absorbed by the plants in your buffer. So you have to realize your windbreak buffer system is meant to be the plants that take up that drift. So where if you do design a buffer that is just that super dense blockage, what it can do is take that particle drift and just force it up and over, and then it's going to come down. And there's really good metrics for the kind of downwind side of that buffer and how tall the plants need to be for how much protection. But as soon as you get outside of that kind of, whatever you want to call it, a wind shadow of the windbreak, then those particles are dropping back out, and it's not as effective as if it was a little less dense and allowing air to come through.
Yeah, you see that with like snowfall patterns on some windbreaks, where the snow actually gets deposited on the opposite side. Sometimes you have these just drifts of snow on the opposite side of a windbreak. It's like, oh, so it just pushed it up and then pushed it back down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing you get where, maybe if you're planning it specifically for, drift reduction, herbicide drift reduction, think about a little less dense of a planting. A lot of the better plants to plant there are things with a lot of surface area. So thin needled plants. I mean, I'm thinking of like white pine or some of our conifers, plants with lots of numerous small branches and lots of surface there. Really the most awesome windbreaks you can put in are multiple species and multiple rows, where, I picture it as large shade trees like your oaks, smaller things like maybe some conifers and shrubs. There's any combination of those, even going down to grasses, where you would kind of step down to a lower height on the windward side. Some other characteristics that are desirable are kind of large leaves that are covered in hairs. So I think we can all think of some plants like that. That hairy leaf surface is going to take up more things. Rough foliage, rough surfaces on leaves. So as you're looking at your plant selection, those are kind of some of the things to think about. And I don't know, I've also got the question about how far is an appropriate setback off the edge of the field? How far should I plant? And I mean, I don't have a great answer for that either. You can see absolute measurements that places recommend, whether it's 25 feet or 50 feet. There's other metrics you can look at where, how high is the spray boom height versus how tall are the plants, and how far away do you need to be? If you have a buffer there, how tall should the plants be? And then how far away should you be from that? So there's I don't think there's really a perfect cookie cutter recipe for this as to how far your setback should be. And, usually my answer is as far away as you can get from the field edge. The very center of your property would be the best. But this is all with respect to particle drift, the physical particles coming in. When we start to look at vapor drift, this invisible gas, I mean, I'm telling you to plant a little more diffuse of a buffer. That's not going to help as much with vapor drift. It's obviously going to slow wind speed down, and wind does carry those vapors into your property, but I don't know that it's not the same concept of your buffer kind of taking up that material. I would say that any of these buffers you can plant will help some with vapor drift. I mean, there's additional plant material in front of your desirable plants that are taking it in. But one thing I've never tested or used in the field, but I've heard folks talk about, and I've heard some organic growers talk about doing this with some luck, is actually putting up a physical fence that is something pretty impermeable, like what they described to me is pretty much essentially like landscape cloth that's hung up on a permanent fence that is then really a pretty strong barrier that with vapor drift, I guess, is kind of pushing it up and over their planting. And so I don't know, that takes a lot of time to construct, and it's a permanent structure in it. But I mean, so it's really difficult to handle this with any one practice, because there's two ways it's kind of getting in for the most part. And which one of these do you want to pick to handle it? I don't know what's going to be your best option.
Well, those are good suggestions, at least. Like it is, each landscape is so nuanced. At least that gives folks a place to start. Now I've got like images of a landscape fabric fence in my landscape, and I'm sure my husband will appreciate that. So,
well, it's not pretty. Yeah,
no.
I don't think that's a very nice looking attribute in the landscape. But just simply, if plant a windbreak. I mean, if you're looking to do something, plant a windbreak. It just helps your property out if you have the space. It helps block some of that incoming wind. It can be all native trees if you focus on that. It can have some ecological benefit. It can just diversify the landscape around your house. So, I mean, that's probably the one basic step that, it's not without cost. Trees and shrubs are expensive wherever you get them. But it's just the one thing that's maybe practical for a lot of folks to do, as opposed to, I don't know how tall of a fence you would need as a barrier, but I guess it depends on the height of your planting and other things. But
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about herbicide trespass. The study did have a few comments about fungicide that we haven't talked about, and I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time on it because the study is a little bit inconclusive. But I thought we should mention the findings. So, Ryan, you want to elaborate on what they found or didn't find?
Yeah, well, like we talked about earlier, later in the season, it was more fungicide damage they saw. And I mean, I guess for me, being pretty plant focused person, I was kind of like, well, hey, fungicide, maybe we'd have a little less anthracnose on our trees, or maybe there'd be a little less. And I guess that happens early. The timing for anthracnose would be wrong because it happens earlier in the spring, but maybe it's limiting a little bit of foliar damage. But it was interesting to me in this study, they talked about just some of the larger ecological effects potentially of that fungicide, which one of the things that rang home to me was some of their future plans are to look at mycorrhizae in the soil. And so for anybody that doesn't remember what mycorrhizae are, they're, we believe, symbiotic relationships with roots, which, there's controversy around that, whether there may be more competitive and it's less just wonderful symbiosis that we thought in the past. But long story short is they help trees take up more moisture and nutrients when they infect a root. And so if a fungicide is in the tree, does it kill the mycorrhizae in the soil? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if we do know the answer to that. Another just interesting point was they were going to maybe look at decomposition rates in the soil. And how does that connect to all this? Well, fungi are a major driver of decomposition of organic matter in the soil environment. And if a fungicide is impacting them, it might impact decomposition rates. And why do we care about that? Well, that's the nutrient exchange in the forest, is the turnover of those leaves and decomposition of those leaves. So it could be a huge factor and on the ecosystem scale, if there's changes there. So
Yeah.
pretty interesting findings.
Yeah, I had those same thoughts too, of like how woodland or prairie, like decomposition needs to happen in prairies. We're not always burning. We're not always, like there's a lot of biomass that builds up in those landscapes too, and wetlands. Like it's just another aspect of the landscape that we are influencing, and we still have more to learn about. So I'm glad. Thank you for elaborating on that. I found that really interesting. Where it was,
Yeah, and so I think another little point that came out of this to me that I thought was interesting was that they noted. So again, they didn't just study forested ecosystems; they had
mhm.
points in prairies and wetlands and other places, and they noted that there was more severe damage or more damage in the more open environments they sampled in, such as a prairie or a wetland. And what does that tell me? Well, I mean, I think, and also, proximity to ag land and other things factor into this, but it makes me wonder if, planting a windbreak as a buffer is maybe a little better of an idea with some of this because it's a less open spot then once you add that something breaking up that wind pattern, that wind flow. I don't know. So I don't know how to take that kind of result, but that was interesting too to hear that I guess those more open areas are just more open to the drift coming in. But that was another kind of significant finding.
Yeah, with that, I thought also, the types of plant material that are in those spaces, like woody versus herbaceous perennials, like the metabolic rates of those plants is different. And I didn't know if that had,
Mm.
an effect on how plants were responding to these chemicals. So,
Yeah, good point. Good point. That could definitely be something at play there between, your grass species and your tree species.
yep. Yep. So, okay. Do we miss anything? I'm going to ask you guys to kind of like summarize your takeaways. We've done it a little bit, but we'll just put a nice bow on it here. But did we miss anything? Or Ryan, do you want to add any like final comments before we do that?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well, top to bottom. And to me, just the biggest takeaway is, I mean, a lot of this damage we're seeing around the landscape can be attributed to herbicides. Um, Seeing it this widespread in this study, and this was done in a repeatable scientific method, so others could repeat this and look at this and try
Yeah.
to look at similar statistical significance and prove true or false the findings of this study. So I feel pretty confident in the results here being comparable around the state. And but again, like we talked about, I think before we go and say herbicide damage for anything, you need to do an investigation. It's not as simple as just looking at leaf characteristics. You've got to really look at that whole environment the plant's in and understand, what else could be at play. But those are my takeaways, at least. It makes me think I'm not crazy in that I'm seeing herbicide damage all around central Illinois. I mean, it, could be the cause of a lot of this. So,
Yeah, I had a very similar reaction, which was I appreciate the scientific method being applied to um, to something that we have seen, we have like I think just suspected, like the as people who are engaged with nature, who are out observing it from year to year, different ecosystems, just making observations. It's nice to have a systematic study done that it can be replicated, and I do believe the intention is to continue to continue to study these spaces. They marked certain trees to go back to and watch the growth rates over time. I look forward to seeing how those trees respond, either recover or are affected by repeat exposure. But it is like validating, like you said, like we're not crazy
mhm.
for thinking we see this all over. Not in like a I'm not excited about it being validated, but knowledge is power. And so then we can, once we have a better understanding of what is going on, we can actually make landscape management decisions that hopefully help support the trees in our lives or
Well,
the ecosystems in our lives.
and I think to me, I mean, again, not really excited about this, but I'm glad to see some progress or some real scientific investigation.
Yeah.
And it sounds like to me they do continue to plan more of this scientific investigation. Like you mentioned, there was 1,400 trees that were marked during this study are plants that they will follow up long term and try and monitor as best they can. They were looking at doing some lab and greenhouse experiments to kind of look at how these pesticides or herbicides interact with plants. And really, the biggest question to answer is, what is the long-term implications of this? Where on the short term, you and I, we're all three of us are probably seeing this year to year. And there's even times where somebody that called me one summer, I talk to the next summer, or they reach out again, and I get to see a little bit of return on what happened to that plant. But I think that at least in my own personal life, where I'm seeing this in nature preserves and areas around me, because I live right in the middle of the rural, central Illinois landscape, it's repeated damage every year to the same plants, because they're kind of in that position on the landscape where they're receiving the wind off a field or off of this adjacent impact. And so to think that somebody's starting to look at that, that's a big question, where it's not killing that mature oak tree, but gosh, it sure isn't helping it out every year to have tiny leaves or distorted leaves. And what does that do after 10 years, after 20 years? I mean, what are we going to see 30 years from now in our forest stand composition? Is it going to be changed, or can these trees weather the storm? We don't know.
Well, I guess I would add that yeah, you see the storm happening. You see the issues, the damage. You see the problems in agriculture, where we have fewer farmers and we have basically fewer eyes on more land. And right now we have to have a lot of human input, whether that is at planting time, whether that is applying a pesticide. A lot of that has to be contracted out, which means everyone is rushing. We have labor costs. We're doing aerial applications. We're trying to cover our bases where maybe we're not scouting as good as we should be and finding what's going on. And so it sounds bleak and terrible, but my hope is applying maybe some new technology for us in the future, incorporating things like artificial intelligence, drones, robotics, things where we can maybe reduce some of those labor inputs and have direct targeted pest action in our agricultural fields. So I am hopeful in the future, as we develop this new technology, that we can employ to reduce maybe the blanket amount of spraying that we do across the Illinois landscape. So fingers crossed, that day is coming.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hope in that area. And I mean, I think all three of us were at the last Farm Progress show at one day or another. And so I toured some of those exhibits, and there was just some really cool stuff going on. And I don't think it was released on the market yet, but one of the sprayer examples had little cameras that would identify the weed and spray only when the weed was there. And so, I mean, we are our technology is really, catching up with this and trying to get us more targeted and, less chemical per acre going out. And so there's a lot of things moving in the right direction to help correct this. But anyway, so yeah, there's hope for the future, I think, across the board on this. And hopefully we can maybe someday there'll be a bunch of drones that just fly out and just spray every weed individually. That'd be the ideal thing, right?
Yes. Well, that was a lot of great information about the issues of chemical trespass, what we're seeing in our forest ecosystems. Again, the study that we talked about and a presentation that is linked to YouTube will be down in the show notes below. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by me, Chris Enroth. Hey, Ryan, a special thanks to you for being our guest today and diving into this 94-page report to kind of come up. We could keep talking, but we better cut ourselves off here. So thank you so much, Ryan, for you pulling out some of those really important pieces of information for us.
Yeah, thanks. Great discussion today. It was fun talking about this with a good growing crew.
Well, thank you. And Emily, thank you very much for joining me from Milan, or as should we go back to Milan, Illinois. It was a pleasure having you here today.
Oh, it is my pleasure to be here. Ryan, this was a fantastic discussion about a really interesting study. So thank you for bringing it to our attention. Really, really appreciate it. Chris, thanks for letting me join you. And I know Ken is away again next week. So why don't we do a garden bite, and then we'll do it again the following week.
That's right. We will do this again next week, the following week. It'll be a garden bite, as Emily said, and the following week well, shoot, it's 4th of July. We'll figure something out. So it will be a fun, festive, explosive, good growing podcast. So but not maybe that last part, but it'll be fun. All right. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.